A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
We are sitting on the edge of a literal powder keg today. It is March 23rd, 2026, and the tension in the Strait of Hormuz has reached a point where the entire global economy is essentially holding its breath. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the mechanics of naval mining and the long-term devastation these weapons leave behind, and it could not be more timely. We are exactly 48 hours into President Trump's ultimatum to the Iranian regime issued back on March 21st, where he threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants unless the waterway is cleared. The threat of an invisible blockade is no longer just a theoretical exercise. It is the defining crisis of the year.
It is a massive shift in the reality of naval warfare. Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been buried in the technical reports coming out of the Bahrain headquarters for the last several hours. We are seeing a 95% reduction in commercial traffic through the strait since this conflict kicked off on February 28th. When you realize that 20% of the world's oil passes through that 39-kilometer wide bottleneck, you start to understand why the Iranian threat to seed the seabed with mines is being treated with such extreme urgency by the White House. This is the Hormuz bottleneck we talked about back in episode 946, but now the risk isn't just about insurance premiums. It is about high explosives and rocket-propelled warheads.
It is the ultimate asymmetric move. You have this massive U.S. naval presence, these multi-billion-dollar carrier strike groups, and yet a guy in a wooden fishing boat can potentially shut down the whole operation with a few $1,000s worth of hardware. Daniel wants to know how this actually works. How do you just seed a waterway like this without being spotted immediately by every satellite and drone in the sky? It feels like in 2026, with all our surveillance, you shouldn't be able to drop a marble in the ocean without someone seeing it.
That is where the Iranian strategy of decentralized command comes into play. The Qatam Al-Anbiya Operational Command, which is the central nervous system for their military operations, has given significant autonomy to local Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval districts. They do not need a massive, identifiable mine layer ship to do this. In fact, using a dedicated mine layer would be suicide right now. Instead, they use what they call Ashura-class fast attack boats and even civilian dhows. If you are a drone operator looking at a screen, a dhow looks like 1,000 other fishing vessels in the Gulf, but these boats are modified with simple mine rails hidden under tarps. They can slip out under the cover of darkness or heavy weather and just drop these units off the back. It is seeding in the most literal sense.
And we are not just talking about those old-school floating balls with the spikes on them, right? The ones you see in old movies like Jaws or World War II documentaries.
Those still exist, and they are still dangerous because they are cheap and easy to manufacture in bulk. But the real threat today, and the focus of Daniel's prompt, comes from bottom mines or seabed mines. These are designed to sink to the floor and stay there. They are weighted so they do not drift with the current, which makes them incredibly difficult to map. Once they hit the silt, they become part of the landscape. The Iranian E-M-52 is the one that keeps naval planners up at night. It is a rocket-propelled mine. It sits on the seafloor and waits. It does not just float there hoping a ship hits it. It uses a sophisticated sensor suite to listen for the specific acoustic signature of a hull, the magnetic field generated by a large vessel, or even the pressure change in the water column as a massive ship passes overhead.
So it is essentially a smart torpedo that lives on the floor. I imagine that makes the invisible part of the invisible blockade literal. If it is buried in the silt or sitting in the shadows of the seabed, how on earth do you find it before a supertanker finds it the hard way?
It is a nightmare for demining. The E-M-52 has a 300-kilogram warhead. To put that in perspective, that is enough explosive force to break the back of a large destroyer or severely cripple a supertanker. And because it is rocket-propelled, it can be deployed in deeper water than a traditional contact mine. When the sensor triggers, it fires the warhead upward at high speed. The ship has zero reaction time. There is no dodging it. What is even more devious is the logic programmed into these influence mines. They have what we call a ship counter. They can be set to ignore the first 3 or 4 ships that pass over them.
Wait, why would you want it to ignore ships? If I am laying a mine, I want it to blow something up immediately to send a message.
Because the first few ships might be small mine-sweeping vessels or escorts. The Iranians want the big prize. They want the high-value supertanker or the aircraft carrier. By programming the mine to wait for a specific magnetic signature or a specific number of passes, they ensure that the waterway looks clear until the most vulnerable and valuable target is right on top of it. It creates this psychological terror where you can never be sure a path is truly safe just because one ship made it through. It turns the entire strait into a game of Russian roulette where the cylinder has 1,000 chambers.
You mentioned the 39-kilometer width of the strait. That is not a lot of room to maneuver, especially when you consider the shipping lanes are even narrower than that, only about 3 kilometers wide in each direction. If they are seeding this area with smart mines that can distinguish between a fishing boat and a tanker, it feels like the US Navy is being forced into a very slow, very dangerous game of minesweeper where the stakes are a global energy crisis.
And the geography is working against us. The strait is shallow in many places, which actually helps the mines. Influence sensors work better when the target is closer. The US Navy has been scrambling to move its mine countermeasures assets into the region. We have seen the transition from the old wooden-hulled Avenger-class ships to the Independence-class littoral combat ships, like the USS Canberra and the USS Santa Barbara. They are based out of Bahrain now. These ships are designed to be modular, but the demining process is still agonizingly slow.
I love how you call it agonizingly slow, while I am over here thinking about how you even start. If I am the commander of the Canberra, and I know there are 6,000 mines potentially sitting on the floor of a 39-kilometer gap, what is step 1? Do you just send a robot down and hope for the best?
Effectively, yes. Step 1 is mine hunting. You use side-scan sonar and sometimes laser-based detection systems, often deployed from MH-60S Seahawk helicopters. They fly over the water and use a system called ALMDS, which is the Airborne Laser Mine Detection System. It looks for reflections from objects near the surface or on the floor. Once you identify a point of interest, you send in the ROVs, the remotely operated vehicles. The Seafox is the standard right now. It is basically a small, one-way underwater drone with a camera and a shaped charge. You pilot it right up to the mine, and then you detonate the Seafox to take out the mine.
One-way drone. So every time you find a mine, you lose a robot. That sounds like a very expensive way to clear a path.
It is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. And remember, you are doing this while Iranian coastal missile batteries are painted on you. This is what I call the Demining Paradox. To clear the mine safely, you need to be in the water with these slow-moving, vulnerable ships. But to protect those ships from land-based missiles or drone swarms, you need to establish total air and sea superiority. But to get your carrier strike groups close enough to maintain that superiority without risk, you need the mines cleared. It is a tactical loop that is very hard to break without a major kinetic escalation, which is exactly where President Trump's ultimatum is pushing the situation. We saw the importance of this infrastructure back in episode 1400 when we talked about Karg Island, Iran's oil fortress. They know that if they can't export, they can make sure nobody else can either.
It is a chess match where one side is playing with invisible pieces, and Daniel's prompt brings up a really haunting point about what happens after the game is over. He asked about the shelf life and dormancy of these things. If we are talking about 6,000 mines, we know for a fact that the US is not going to find every single one of them. What happens to the ones that are left behind?
That is the truly terrifying part of naval mining. These are the ultimate fire-and-forget weapons, but they never really forget. Modern smart mines have long-life batteries that can keep their sensors active for years. Even when those batteries eventually die, the explosive doesn't just disappear. The chemical compounds in the warheads are incredibly stable. We are still finding and detonating World War II-era mines in the North Sea and the Pacific today, more than 80 years after they were dropped. A mine doesn't care if a peace treaty was signed in 2027. If a hull passes over it in 2090, it will do exactly what it was designed to do.
80 years. So we could be looking at a situation where the March 2026 crisis is a footnote in history books, but a fisherman in 2100 hits a legacy mine from this week and loses his life.
It is a permanent alteration of the environment. And Daniel pointed to a very specific example on land that illustrates this perfectly, the Golan Heights and the Jordan Valley. In January of this year, 2026, the Israeli Ministry of Defense finally started a massive project to clear about 500 anti-tank mines in the Jordan Valley. These mines have been sitting there since the late 1960s. Think about that. For 60 years, that land has been a no-go zone. You cannot farm it, you cannot build on it, you cannot even walk on it.
And that is on land where you can at least see the fences and the warning signs. In the water, there are no fences. If a mine from this Iranian stockpile drifts or just stays dormant on the seabed, it becomes a permanent hazard for global trade.
The Israeli project is a great case study because it shows how much effort is required to fix even a small area. They are using specialized armored bulldozers and mine-clearing robots, and it is still taking months to clear just 500 units. Now scale that up to the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran follows through on this threat to lay thousands of mines, they are essentially creating a generational blockade. Even after a peace treaty is signed, insurance companies like Lloyd's of London are going to look at the Persian Gulf and see a high-risk zone for decades. The shipping rates will stay high, the oil prices will stay volatile, and the risk of a random explosion will hang over every captain going through those waters.
It is a form of environmental terrorism, really. You are polluting a vital waterway with lethal obstacles that do not have an expiration date. I think people often overlook the human cost of these legacy weapons. You mentioned a UN report from 2023 that said landmines still kill or maim 5,000 people every year. Most of those people weren't even born when the mines were laid.
That is the tragedy of it. These weapons do not distinguish between a combatant in a time of war and a civilian in a time of peace. In the Golan, the UNDOF forces, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, have been dealing with this for decades. It limits where they can patrol, it limits how they can monitor the ceasefire. It creates this frozen landscape where progress is impossible. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes a maritime version of the Golan Heights minefields, the impact on global energy security would be catastrophic. We are talking about the jugular vein of the world economy.
It makes me wonder about the shift in naval doctrine. If mines are this effective and this persistent, why hasn't every coastal nation just filled their waters with them?
Well, because it is a double-edged sword. If Iran mines the strait, they also mine their own ability to export oil from Karg Island. They are currently under massive pressure, and their economy is already reeling from the February 28th conflict start. Mining the strait is a Samson option. It is pulling the pillars of the temple down on everyone, including themselves. But from a conservative, realist perspective, we have to assume that a regime backed into a corner will take the most destructive path available. That is why the U.S. Navy's focus on the littoral combat ships is so critical. We have to be able to clear these paths faster than they can seed them, but the math is brutal.
How brutal. If we are using one-way robots to blow up mines one by one, and they have 6,000 of them, the math doesn't look great for a quick resolution before the global economy tanks.
It really isn't, and it is not just about the number of mines, it is about the false positives. The seabed is full of junk. There are old shipwrecks, discarded shipping containers, even large rocks that can look like a bottom mine on sonar. Every time the sonar hits a shape that looks suspicious, the whole operation has to stop. A drone has to be deployed, and an investigation has to happen. It can take hours to clear a single contact that turns out to be an old refrigerator. Multiply that by the thousands of objects on the floor of a busy shipping lane, and you see why the invisible blockade is such an effective strategy.
It turns the entire ocean floor into a crime scene that you have to investigate inch by inch. I am curious about the sweeping side of things. You mentioned mine hunting with sonar. But what about the old school sweeping, where you just drag something behind a ship and try to trigger the mines? Is that still a thing in 2026?
It is, but it is becoming less effective against smart mines. Traditional sweeping involves towing a sled or a cable that emits a strong magnetic field or a loud acoustic noise to trick the mine into thinking a big ship is passing by. But remember what I said about the influence sensors? If the mine is programmed to wait for the fourth ship, or if it is looking for a very specific pressure signature that a sled cannot replicate, it will just sit there and let the sweep pass right over it. Then, when the actual tanker comes along 10 minutes later, that is when it wakes up.
So, the mines are getting smarter, which makes the demining process more about hunting than sweeping. You have to find the specific object and neutralize it, rather than just trying to trigger everything in the area. This brings us back to the persistence issue. If you miss one, just one, that is a headline that crashes the stock market the next day.
And that is the lever Iran is pulling. They do not need to sink every ship, they just need to sink one and prove that they can. The threat of the mine is often more powerful than the mine itself. Once a single tanker is hit, the insurance companies will immediately pull coverage for the entire region. No insurance means no shipping. No shipping means the strait is closed, regardless of whether there are 5 mines left or 5,000.
It is a psychological blockade. We saw this in the Golan as well. Even in areas where the Israeli military has cleared paths, people are still terrified to walk there because the ghost of the mine remains. The uncertainty is a weapon in itself. It is fascinating to see how the technical reality of a battery-powered sensor on the bottom of the ocean translates directly into the price of gas at a station in Ohio, or the strategic calculations in the Oval Office.
It is the ultimate bridge between high-tech engineering and ancient, brutal warfare. We are using lasers and autonomous underwater vehicles to fight against what is essentially a hidden bomb. And the fact that we are still dealing with the legacy of the 1960s and the Golan Heights should be a massive warning sign for what is happening right now in the Persian Gulf. We are making decisions today that will have literal, physical consequences for the next century.
It is a sobering thought. We like to think that technology solves problems, but in this case, technology has just made the problem more persistent and harder to detect. The invisible blockade isn't just a clever phrase. It is a description of a new kind of permanent conflict zone.
I think the takeaway for anyone watching this crisis unfold is that demining isn't a post-war activity. It is the war. The ability to keep those lanes open is the central front of this conflict. If the U.S. and its allies cannot demonstrate a reliable, fast way to neutralize this seeding. Strategy, the strategic map of the Middle East, changes forever. The Strait of Hormuz stops being a global highway and starts being a guarded, dangerous alleyway.
And that is a world where the leverage shifts away from the traditional naval powers and toward anyone who can afford a few dows and a crate of E-M-52s. It is a democratization of destruction, and it is happening right in front of us.
What I find most striking is the shift in how the Israeli Ministry of Defense is handling the Jordan Valley project. They aren't just clearing the mines, they are using it as a testing ground for new autonomous detection systems. They know that the future of their security depends on being able to reclaim land that has been dead for 60 years. If they can figure out how to do it efficiently on land, maybe those lessons can be applied to the maritime environment. But right now, the ocean is a much harder problem to solve because water is a great hiding place. It absorbs light, it distorts sound, and it protects the weapons from the elements.
It is the perfect vault for a dormant threat. I think we have covered the how and the why pretty thoroughly here, Herman. It is a grim picture, but a necessary one to understand if we are going to make sense of the headlines over the next few days, as that 48-hour clock runs down. The looming question is whether the strait can be reopened without a full-scale kinetic conflict, or if the mere presence of these mines has already changed the game.
It is all about the dormancy. Whether it is a mine in the Golan Heights or a rocket-propelled warhead in the Strait of Hormuz, these things are built to wait. And they are very, very patient.
Well, I think that gives us plenty to chew on. The persistence of these weapons is really the key takeaway here. They don't just go away when the politicians stop talking. They stay in the mud, they stay in the silt, and they wait for someone to make a mistake decades down the line. It is a heavy legacy to leave behind for future generations of sailors and fishermen.
It really is. And as we see the U.S. Navy moving those literal combat ships into position, we should remember that they aren't just fighting a regime, they are fighting against the gravity of decades of hidden explosives.
Big thanks to Daniel for that prompt. It really forced us to look past the immediate tactical situation and into the long-term structural risks of naval mining. It is a perfect example of why we do this show, to get into the weeds or the silt of these complex topics.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping us on track while I dive into these technical manuals.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to process all this data in real time. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, especially with everything going on in the world right now, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach more people who want to understand the how behind the headlines.
We will be watching the Strait closely. Stay curious, everyone.
See you in the next one. Clear skies and safe passage.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from slow